May 14th, 1973. There is a house flying through the sky, 170 miles above the surface of the Earth. It is the largest object ever placed into orbit. It is 80 feet long, weighs 77 tons, and has the interior volume of a 3-bedroom suburban home. It is America's first space station. It is named Skylab, but there is nobody home. And the house is burning. Not with fire. There is no oxygen outside to feed a flame, but with radiation. The sun, a nuclear furnace 93 million miles away, is hammering the metal skin of the station with relentless thermal energy. The temperature inside the workshop is climbing. It hits 100 degrees Fahrenheit, then 110, then 120. The air inside, breathable oxygen and nitrogen, is baking. The plastic insulation on the wires is starting to outgas, releasing toxic fumes like cyanide and toluene. The food in the lockers is spoiling. The film in the cameras is fogging. The station is dying. It has been in orbit for less than an hour, and it is already a $2.6 billion piece of space junk. On the ground, in the windowless rooms of Mission Control in Houston, the engineers are staring at their screens in disbelief. The telemetry streams are screaming disaster. They see zero voltage from the main solar arrays. They see the temperature sensors pinning the needles. They see the gyroscope data wobbling. They realize, with a sinking feeling in their guts, that the station hasn't just malfunctioned, it has been mutilated. Something violent happened during the launch. Something tore the ship apart. And in 10 days, 3 men are supposed to launch a rocket, fly up to this toxic, overheating, broken hulk, and live inside it for a month. The flight directors look at the data. They look at the calendar. Most rational people would say the mission is over. You cannot live in a furnace. You cannot run a space station without electricity. But this is NASA in 1973. These are the men who landed on the moon with 16-bit computers. They don't cancel missions. They fix problems. This is the story of the greatest repair job in history. It is not a story about sleek science fiction or clean laboratories. It is a story about sweat, muscle, and duct tape. It is a story about a crew of astronauts who went into the void armed not with lasers or robots, but with a hacksaw, a pry bar, and a parasol made of fishing poles. It is the story of how Pete Conrad and his crew saved Skylab with their bare hands. To understand the scale of the disaster, we have to look at the machine itself. Skylab was a beast. It was built from the dry, third stage of a Saturn V rocket. The engineers took the massive fuel tank that usually pushed Apollo to the moon, scrubbed it out, and turned it into a laboratory. It was a masterpiece of recycling. It had a shower. It had a wardroom with a table. It had a massive open area where astronauts could fly like Superman. But because it was essentially a converted fuel tank, its skin was thin aluminum. It needed protection from the sun and from micrometeoroids. Tiny rocks zipping through space at 17,000 miles per hour, so the engineers wrapped the station in a micrometeoroid shield. It was a thin sheet of aluminum held tight against the side of the station during launch. Once in orbit, spring-loaded arms were supposed to push it out 5 inches, creating a gap. This shield would block the space dust and shade the station from the sun. It was a simple, elegant design. But aerodynamics is a cruel mistress. On launch day, the mighty Saturn V roared off the pad at Cape Canaveral. It was the last time a Saturn V would ever fly. It was a perfect launch, or so it seemed. The vibration was intense. The noise was deafening. But 63 seconds into the flight, as the rocket smashed through the sound barrier and hit max Q, the point of maximum aerodynamic pressure, a tiny flaw in the design turned into a catastrophe. Air got under the shield. The rushing wind turned the shield into a sail. The pressure built up instantly. ADIP. The aluminum shield ripped away from the station with the violence of a bomb going off, but it didn't just fall off. As it tore away, it wrapped around one of the two massive solar wings number 2. It sheared it off completely. The giant array, the station's main power source, was flung into the Atlantic Ocean. The debris from the shield then swung around and hit the other solar wing. Solar wing number 1, it didn't tear it off, but it jammed it. A piece of metal strap tangled in the deployment mechanism. So, when Skylab reached orbit and the computer commanded the wings to open, nothing happened. Wing 2 was gone. Wing 1 was stuck shut, pinned against the side of the ship by scrap metal, and the shield, the sunshade, was gone. Skylab was naked. It was tilted toward the sun to get maximum power for its remaining telescope solar panels, which were tiny, but that meant the unshielded hull was baking in direct sunlight. It was a worst-case scenario. No power, no heat protection. Houston commanded the station to maneuver to hide from the sun, but then the batteries started to die. If they turned the solar panels to the sun, the station cooked. If they turned the hull away to cool down, the power died. They were trapped in a paradox. "We are losing the bird," a flight controller whispered. In the hallways of the Marshall Space Flight Center in Alabama and the Johnson Space Center in Houston, the panic was controlled, but it was real. They had about 10 days before the station became unrecoverable, before the heat melted the internal wiring or the poisonous gases made it uninhabitable forever. They needed a plan, and they needed a commander who could execute the impossible. Enter Charles Pete Conrad. If you were casting a movie about a space mechanic, you would cast Pete Conrad. He was not the stoic, poetic type like Neil Armstrong. He was short, gap-toothed, balding, and had a high-pitched, cackling laugh that was infectious. He stood 5'6" on a good day, but Pete Conrad was widely considered the best pilot in the astronaut corps. He was a Princeton graduate, but he talked like a Philadelphia dock worker. He drove race cars. He fell off motorcycles. He was fierce, funny, and absolutely fearless. He had flown Gemini. He had walked on the moon on Apollo 12. He had saved that mission after lightning struck the rocket simply by knowing which switch to flip. Conrad was a hands-on guy. He didn't care about the theory. He cared about whether it worked. When they told him the station was broken, he didn't ask for a new flight plan. He asked for tools. "We gotta go up there and fix it," he said. "Give me a pry bar and some cutters." His crew was composed of Joe Kerwin, a physician astronaut, and Paul Weitz, a pilot. They were rookies, but they were tough. For the next 10 days, NASA went into garage mode. The bureaucracy vanished. The safety meetings were shortened. The problem was twofold. They needed to cool the station down immediately upon arrival. They needed to free the jammed solar wing to get power. How do you shade a massive spaceship in orbit? You build a parasol. The engineers looked at the designs. The station had a small scientific airlock, a shimmering square hole in the side of the wall, about 8 inches wide, used for taking photos. Maybe they could push something through that hole. They went to a local fishing supply store. They bought telescoping fiberglass fishing rods. They went to a fabric store. They bought lightweight nylon and mylar material used for parachutes and thermal blankets. On the floor of the hangar, engineers were on their hands and knees sewing. They were stitching together a massive square sunshade, 24 feet by 22 feet. They attached it to the fishing poles. The idea was, fold it up like an umbrella, shove it through the tiny airlock, and then extend the poles to open it up over the hot skin of the station. It was ridiculous. It looked like a camping tent. "It's a Rube Goldberg contraption," someone said. "Yeah," Conrad replied. "But will it work? Maybe." Then came the tools for the solar wing. They looked at blurry photos of the station taken by military spy telescopes. They could see a strap of metal pinning the wing down. They needed to cut it. But you can't just walk up to it. The solar wing was far away from the airlock. They needed a cutter with a long reach. They took a standard pair of tree loppers, the kind you use to trim branches in your garden. They attached them to a 10-foot pole. They attached a pull rope to the handles. They tested it on metal straps. Snap, it worked. They built a pry bar, a shepherd's crook, to pull the wing open. This was not high-tech aerospace engineering. This was hardware store ingenuity. This was American know-how at its finest. The crew practiced in the water tank. They practiced with the sunshade. They practiced with the cutters. They worked 20-hour days. On May 25, 1973, just 11 days after the station launched, Pete Conrad, Joe Kerwin, and Paul Weitz strapped into their Apollo command module. They were riding a Saturn IB rocket, smaller than the moon rocket but still a skyscraper. They had the parasol folded up under their seats. They had the tree loppers strapped to the wall. "Let's go fix this thing," Conrad said. They launched. The chase took 7 hours. The Apollo capsule, carrying the 3 mechanics, hunted down the wounded Skylab in the darkness. As they closed in, the radar pinged. They saw the bright star of the station ahead. Conrad flew the ship. He brought them in close. And then they saw it. It was a shock. Skylab didn't look like the pristine white station in the brochure. It looked like a wreck. The micrometeorite shield was gone, leaving the gold foil insulation exposed. The gold was blistered and blackened by the sun. Solar Wing 2 was completely missing, just a jagged stump of wires and metal where it had torn off. And Solar Wing 1, it was partially deployed, just a few inches stuck like a broken bird's wing. A strip of aluminum from the shield was wrapped around it, bolted down by a single rivet, holding the mighty wing captive. "It looks like a tin can that got hit by a hammer," White said. Conrad flew around the station, inspecting the damage. "Okay," he said to Houston, "we see the strap. We see the rivet. I think we can cut it." But before they could dock and go inside, they had to try to free the wing. The plan was a stand-up EVA. This was a dangerous maneuver. They would depressurize their Apollo capsule while hovering next to the station. Paul Weitz would open the hatch, stand up on his seat, and lean out into space with the long shepherd's crook tool. Joe Kerwin would hold onto his legs to keep him from floating away. Pete Conrad would fly the spacecraft, bringing it within inches of the spinning, tumbling station. It was like trying to change a tire on a moving car while leaning out the window of another moving car. "We're going in," Conrad said. He nudged the thrusters. The Apollo crept toward the jammed wing. Weitz opened the hatch. The vacuum sucked out the remaining air. He stood up. He was waist-deep in the void. He held the 10-foot pole. Conrad flew closer. 5 feet. 3 feet. The station was swaying. The thrusters were firing. Bang, 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 keeping them steady. "I got it," Weitz yelled. He hooked the shepherd's crook onto the solar wing. He pulled with all his strength. It's not budging. The metal strap was fused tight. The angle was wrong. Conrad tried to maneuver the ship to give him better leverage, but the thruster plumes were hitting the station's skin, risking damage to the delicate solar panels. "Pull harder," Paul Weitz grunted, straining against the suit. His heart rate spiked. "I can't do it. It's stuck solid." They struggled for an hour. The sun began to set. They were moving into the night side of the Earth. Darkness was falling. "We have to back off," Houston ordered. "It's too dangerous in the dark." White slumped back into the capsule. He was exhausted. His hands were cramping. They closed the hatch. Strike one. The wing was still stuck. The station was still power-starved, but the day wasn't over. Now they had to dock. They lined up the Apollo probe with the Skylab drogue. Conrad flew it in smoothly. Thump. Contact, but the latches didn't fire. The docking mechanism failed. They bounced off. "We didn't get a capture," Conrad said. He backed up. He tried again, harder this time. Thump. Nothing. The heavy Apollo capsule bounced off the 7.7-ton station like a rubber ball. "Houston, we have a problem. We can't dock." The mood in mission control turned dark. If they couldn't dock, they couldn't enter the station. If they couldn't enter, the mission was over. They would have to come home, and Skylab would burn up. They had fuel for maybe 2 or 3 more attempts. It was getting late. The astronauts had been awake for 20 hours. They were tired, frustrated, and floating next to a broken house they couldn't enter. Conrad looked at his crew. "We are not going home," he said. "What do? We fixed the probe." They took apart the docking mechanism inside the tunnel of their ship. They bypassed the electrical safety switches. They hot-wired the system. It was risky. If the probe retracted too early, it could punch a hole in their own ship. "Okay," Conrad said. "One more try. I'm going to hit it hard." He lined up the ship. He fired the thrusters. He didn't just glide in, he rammed it. The speed was faster than the manual allowed. Crash. The ships collided. The shock shuddered through the frame, but the latches triggered. Clunk-click. "We have capture." They were docked. Hard duct. They were attached to Skylab, but they were exhausted. They ate a cold meal and slept in the Apollo capsule. The next morning, they would have to open the hatch and enter the beast. They didn't know what they would find inside. Would the air be poisonous? Would the heat kill them? They put on their gas masks. Conrad floated to the hatch of the station. He turned the handle. The wheel spun. He pushed the door open. A wave of heat hit him. It was like opening an oven door. The temperature inside was 130 degrees Fahrenheit. "It's hot," Conrad said, "but it looks clear." They floated into the cavernous workshop. It was eerie. The station was huge, but it was dark and sweltering. The walls were hot to the touch. The air was thin and dry. They checked the air quality sensors. No poison gas. That was the first miracle. But the heat was unbearable. They couldn't stay in there for long. They had to deploy the parasol. They found the scientific airlock, the small square hole in the wall. They dragged the bundled-up fishing pole contraption out of the Apollo. This was the moment of truth. If the parasol tangled, if it didn't open, the station would never cool down. They shoved the canister through the hole. Conrad and Weitz operated the rods. Extending outside, unseen by them, the nylon square began to unfurl. The spring-loaded arms snapped out. It wasn't perfect. It was a bit wrinkled. It didn't cover the entire station, but it cast a shadow. Inside the station, the temperature began to drop. Slowly, 129, 128, 125. "It's working," Kerwin said. "The heat is breaking." They had saved the ship from cooking itself, but they still had no power. The batteries were draining. They couldn't run the experiments. They couldn't run the fans. They were living in a dim, hot cave. They looked out the window at the stuck solar wing. It was taunting them, a massive sheet of power pinned down by a scrap of aluminum. "We have to go out there," Conrad said. "We have to cut that strap." But the stand-up Eva had failed. The tools weren't strong enough. They needed a new plan. And they needed to do something no astronaut had ever done before. They needed to perform a spacewalk, an EVA that wasn't practiced. They needed to go off script. Ground control was nervous. "We don't know if you can reach it." Conrad laughed his cackling laugh. "We'll reach it. We'll crawl if we have to." They spent the next week preparing. They looked at the wing. They argued with Houston about the procedure. They were going to turn the station so the wing faced the sun. Then Conrad and Kerwin would go out. They would climb along the hull, 60 feet through the void, carrying a cable cutter and a pry bar. There were no handrails out there. It was smooth metal. If they slipped, they would float away into the black. It was the most dangerous repair job ever attempted, and it was scheduled for June 7th, the day the fate of Skylab would be decided. Let us pause here in the sweltering heat of the workshop. The three men are floating in their underwear, sweating, waiting. The parasol is up, flapping silently in the vacuum. The broken wing is waiting outside. They are tired, they are dirty, but they are ready. The real work is about to begin. The walk into the void, the struggle with the metal, the moment when the lights turn on. Part 2 is coming, and it brings the hammer. For the first week of June 1973, the Skylab space station was a purgatory. The parasol was deployed. Yes, the temperature inside had dropped from a lethal 130 degrees to a manageable sticky 85 degrees. The toxic outgassing had stopped. The air was breathable, but the station was crippled. It was surviving on a starvation diet of electricity. Without the main solar wings, Skylab relied on the 4 smaller solar panels mounted on the Apollo telescope mount, a windmill-shaped structure on top of the station. These panels were designed to power the telescopes, not the entire laboratory. They provided about 4,000 watts of power. The station needed 8,000 watts to function properly. It was running at 50% capacity. Inside, the astronauts were living in a dim, humid cave. They had to turn off the lights to save power. They couldn't run the air circulation fans at full speed, so pockets of carbon dioxide would form in the corners. They couldn't run the experiments. They couldn't even heat their food properly. Every time the station passed into the Earth's shadow, the night side of the orbit, the batteries began to drain. The voltage alarms would scream. The crew would scramble to shut down heaters and transmitters, trying to nurse the dying batteries through the darkness until the sun came back. It was a miserable existence. Pete Conrad, Joe Kerwin, and Paul Weitz were working 18-hour days, floating in their underwear to stay cool, fighting a ship that wanted to die. And outside the window, taunting them, was Solar Wing Number 1. It was still there, jammed, pinned against the side of the hull by a crumpled strip of aluminum debris from the launch accident. It was a sleeping giant. If they could free it, it would deploy, unfold its panels, and flood the station with 5,000 watts of clean, limitless power. The lights would come on. The fans would spin. The mission would be saved. But if they couldn't free it, Skylab was doomed. The batteries would eventually fail. The mission would be aborted. The billions of dollars, the years of work, the national pride, all of it would burn up in the atmosphere. The decision was made in Houston. They had to go out. They had to perform an extravehicular activity, an EV, a spacewalk. But this wasn't a standard spacewalk. Standard spacewalks are rehearsed for months. Every movement is choreographed. Every handhold is marked. Every bolt is accessible. This was a salvage operation. They were going to climb over the exterior of the station, a smooth, cylindrical hull with no handrails, dragging heavy tools to a location that was never designed to be reached by a human being. It was mountaineering in a vacuum. The ground crew at Marshall Space Flight Center scrambled to find a solution. They put Rusty Schweikart, the backup commander, in the giant, neutral buoyancy water tank. He spent hours underwater mocking up the repair. "It's going to be slippery," Schweikart reported. "There's nothing to hold onto, but if they can get a cutter on the debris, it might snap." The engineers built the tools. They took the heavy-duty cable cutters, the tree loppers. They extended the handles. They tied lanyards to everything. They developed a plan. Pete Conrad and Joe Kerwin would do the walk. Paul Weitz would stay inside the Apollo capsule to monitor the systems. Conrad would lead. He would carry a 5-foot-long pole with a cutter on the end. He would also carry a pry bar, essentially a crowbar modified for space. They would have to traverse the length of the station, secure themselves near the jammed wing, cut the metal strap, and then force the frozen hinge to open. It sounded simple, but in zero gravity, nothing is simple. Newton's third law, for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction, is a tyrant. If you push a bolt, the bolt pushes back. If you aren't anchored, you spin. If you slip, you float away into the black, and they would be working right next to the sharp, jagged metal of the torn debris. One slip of the cutter, one jagged edge touching the suit, and the suit would rip. A rip in a pressure suit is fatal in seconds. The stakes couldn't be higher. June 7th, 1973, the day of the walk. Conrad and Kerwin woke up early. They ate a cold breakfast. They drank water mixed with electrolytes. They floated into the airlock module. Putting on a spacesuit in orbit is a wrestling match. The A7LP suits were bulky, stiff, multi-layered armor. They had to wiggle into them, connect to cooling water hoses, connect to communication cables, lock the helmets, and put on the gloves. The gloves were the most critical part. They were thick, rubber, and fabric, pressurized. Moving your fingers required constant force. It was like squeezing a tennis ball every time you wanted to grab something. After a few hours, your forearms would burn, your fingernails would bruise, and your grip would fail. They checked the seals. Pressure integrity is good, Conrad said. They depressurized the airlock. The air hissed out into space. The needle dropped to zero. Conrad opened the hatch. The universe flooded in. The sheer brightness of the sun in orbit is shocking. It is a hard white light that washes out shadows and hurts the eyes, even through the gold-plated visor. Below them, the Earth was a massive rolling tapestry of blue and white. They were passing over the Pacific Ocean. But Conrad didn't look down. He looked at the job. He floated out of the hatch. He grabbed the handrail. "I'm out," he said. Kerwin followed him, dragging the bundle of tools. The tools were awkward. The poles were long and unwieldy. In zero gravity, they had no weight, but they still had mass. If you got them moving, they didn't want to stop. They were like slow-motion battering rams. Now began the traverse. They had to move from the airlock, located in the middle of the station, to the end of the Apollo telescope mount, and then look down at the solar wing on the side of the hull. There were no handrails for most of the journey. They had to use the anti-fog compound, a chemical wipe usually used to keep their visors clear, to wipe down the smooth metal of the station to get a better grip, or hook their tethers onto antennas. It was exhausting work. Their heart rates climbed 120 beats per minute, 130. They were breathing hard. The sound of their breath was loud in the open microphones. "Take it slow," Houston said. "Watch your metabolic rates." "We're fine," Conrad grunted. "Just moving furniture." They reached the work site. They looked down at the jammed wing. It was a mess. The aluminum strap from the meteoroid shield was wrapped around the deployment mechanism like a tourniquet. It was punched through with a rivet, locking the wing tight against the side of the ship. And it was cold. The wing had been in the shadow of the station for weeks. A hydraulic damper, the shock absorber that controlled the speed of the wing's opening, was frozen solid. Even if they cut the strap, the fluid inside the damper might be too viscous to move. Conrad positioned himself. He wrapped his legs around a strut on the telescope mount. He needed a solid anchor. Kerwin moved down toward the wing. He was the surgeon. He had the cutter. The cutter was mounted on a long pole. He had to guide the jaws of the cutter onto the metal strap, but he couldn't get close enough. He was floating free. Every time he tried to push the cutter, he floated backward. "I can't get purchase," Kerwin said. He was flailing. "This is the nightmare of EVA. You can see the problem. You can reach the problem. But you can't apply force." Conrad improvised. "Joe, give me your tether." Conrad took the retractable tether from Kerwin's suit and hooked it onto a sturdy part of the antenna boom. "Okay, pull yourself in," Conrad said. Kerwin used the tether to winch himself down, tight against the hull. He was now anchored. He lined up the cutter again. The jaws of the tool were open. He tried to slip them over the metal strap. It didn't fit. The strap was crumpled. It was twisted. The jaws were too narrow. "It won't go," Kerwin said. Frustration crept into his voice. They were 90 minutes into the spacewalk. Their hands were starting to ache. "Try the other angle," Conrad directed. Kerwin twisted his body. He maneuvered the long pole. He managed to get one jaw onto the strap, but he couldn't get the other jaw over the top. He pushed. He pulled. Nothing. The ground controllers listened in silence. They couldn't help. They couldn't see what the astronauts were seeing. They could only wait. "I'm going to try to pry it," Kerwin said. He used the cutter as a lever. He pulled back on the pole, trying to force the strap into the jaws. Suddenly, it slipped. The cutter jumped. It banged against the hull. Conrad watched, holding his breath. If the cutter hit the spacesuit, game over. "Easy, Joe. Easy." Kerwin took a breath. He rested for a moment. He tried again. This time he got the jaws seated. The metal strap was deep in the throat of the cutter. "I've got it," Kerwin said. Now came the physical part. The cutter was manual. It operated by pulling a rope lanyard. It required about 80 pounds of force to shear the metal. In a gym on Earth, pulling 80 pounds is easy. In a pressurized suit, floating in space, with tired hands, it is a Herculean task. Kerwin grabbed the rope. He braced his feet. "Here goes." He pulled. Nothing. The metal didn't yield. He pulled harder. He grunted with the effort. "It's tough." Conrad moved down. He grabbed the rope too. "On 3, Conrad said. 1, 2, 3. 2 astronauts, hanging off the side of a spaceship, pulled with everything they had. Snap. The sound vibrated through their suits. The jaws bit through the aluminum. The strap severed. The 2 pieces of debris flew apart, spinning away into the void. "We cut it!" Kerwin yelled. "It's free!" Houston cheered. "Copy that. Strap is cut." Everyone expected the wing to spring open. It was spring-loaded. It should have popped out like a jack-in-the-box. They watched the wing. It didn't move. It sat there, just a few inches from the hull, frozen. The silence returned. "It's not deploying," Conrad said. The cold had won. The hydraulic damper inside the hinge was frozen. The grease had turned to glue. The springs weren't strong enough to push the cold fluid through the piston. They had cut the lock, but the door was rusted shut. They looked at the wing. It was huge, 30 feet long. They couldn't just leave it. They had come this far. Conrad looked at the situation. He saw the beam of the solar wing deployment linkage. "I think if I can get under it, I can force it," Conrad said. He was talking about brute force. He was talking about the human jack maneuver. It wasn't in the manual. It wasn't in the training. Conrad moved to the base of the wing. He placed his feet on the hull of the station. He took the tether hook and looped it under the solar wing beam. He tied the other end to his suit harness. The idea was to stand up. By standing up, he would use his legs, the strongest muscles in the body, to pull the tether tight and force the beam upward. It was a deadlift in space, but it was dangerous. If the wing suddenly broke free, it would snap out with thousands of pounds of force. It could hit Conrad. It could fling him off the station. It could smash his helmet. "Be careful, Pete," Kerwin said. "I got this," Conrad muttered. He crouched down. He took up the slack in the tether. He was a small man, but he was wire-strong. He grunted. "Ah!" He pushed with his legs. The suit stiffened. The tether went taut. The beam groaned. He lifted. Nothing. "Joe, get under it with me." Kerwin moved in. He put his shoulder under the pole. "Ready?" "Ready." They pushed. They strained. Their hearts were pounding at 160 beats per minute. The beam bent. The frozen hydraulics resisted. And then Wham! The ice broke. The damper gave way, the wings snapped outward. It moved fast. It flung Conrad and Kerwin away from the hull like ragdolls. They tumbled backward into space. For a second, there was chaos. A blur of white suits, black sky, and silver metal. But their safety tethers held. They bounced at the end of their lines, spinning. Conrad laughed, that high-pitched, cackling laugh. Whoa! Look at that. They looked back at the station. The solar wing was opening. Like a giant accordion, the panels were unfolding. 1 section, 2 sections, 3 sections. It was beautiful. It stretched out into the sunlight, 30 feet of dark blue silicon cells drinking in the energy of the star. Inside the station, the telemetry boards lit up. The voltage meters jumped 20 volts, 25 volts, 30 volts. The amperage climbed. We have power, the Capcom shouted. We see the amps. You did it. Conrad and Kerwin stabilized themselves. They were hanging in the void, exhausted, sweating, their hands cramping, their suits smeared with grease. But they were grinning. They had done the impossible. With a pair of garden shears and a piece of rope, they had saved a $2 billion spacecraft. Okay, Conrad said, catching his breath. Let's clean up and go home. They gathered their tools. They didn't leave anything behind. As they made their way back to the airlock, the sun began to set. They passed into the darkness of the Earth's shadow, but this time the station didn't die. The batteries were charging, the lights inside stayed on. Skylab was alive. They climbed back into the airlock. They closed the hatch. They repressurized. When they took off their helmets, they were soaked. Their hair was matted. Their faces were red. Paul Weitz was waiting for them with towels and water bags. Good job, guys, he said. Good job. They floated into the main workshop. It was already cooler. The fans were humming with a new, stronger pitch. The air felt cleaner. They had turned a wreck into a home. Pete Conrad floated to the wardroom window. He looked out at the deployed wing. It was rigid, strong. He looked down at the Earth passing below. The lights of the cities were twinkling in the night. He thought about the engineers on the ground who sewed the parasol. He thought about the guys who modified the cutters. He realized that this mission wasn't about the technology. It was about the stubbornness. The refusal to quit. We fixed it, he whispered to himself. And then he pushed off the wall and went to find some dinner. He was starving. But the mission wasn't over. They had saved the ship, but now they had to live in it. They had to prove that humans could survive in space for 28 days, double the previous record. They had to become the first long-term residents of orbit, and Skylab had more surprises in store for them. The high-fidelity medical experiments, the spinning chair, the sheer joy of the runway and the upper deck, and the realization that living in space changes you. Not just your body, your bones, your muscles, your blood, but your mind. As the adrenaline of the repair faded, a new rhythm set in, a rhythm of work, observation, and profound isolation. They were 3 men in a tin can drifting through the summer of 1973, and they were about to discover what it really means to be a spacefarer. Let us drift with them for a moment. The excitement of the EVA is fading. The tools are stowed. The station is quiet. You can hear the hum of the gyroscopes, huge flywheels that keep the station pointed at the sun. You can hear the creak of the metal as it cools in the shadow. You are floating in the wardroom. Your feet are hooked under a strap. You are holding a bag of rehydrated shrimp cocktail. Outside the window, a thunderstorm is flashing over Africa. Silent pulses of light. You are safe. The power is on. The house is fixed. The long haul begins now. Relax into the drift. The hard part is over, or so they thought. Because space always has another test. Always. The house was saved. The lights were on. The air was cool, but now the three men had to live in it, and they had to work. The repair of Skylab was a sprint, a frantic adrenaline-fueled dash to stop a catastrophe, but the mission itself was a marathon. Pete Conrad, Joe Kerwin, and Paul Weitz were tasked with staying in orbit for 28 days. This sounds routine today, where astronauts live on the International Space Station for 6 months or a year, but in 1973 it was the edge of the unknown. The previous American record was 14 days set by Frank Borman and Jim Lovell on Gemini 7, and they had come back weak, wobbling, barely able to stand. The Soviets had kept a crew up for 23 days on Salyut 1 in 1971, but that crew had died during re-entry due to a valve failure, so nobody really knew what would happen to the human body after a month in zero gravity. Would the bones turn to chalk? Would the heart atrophy? Would the immune system collapse? Would the mind snap? Skylab 2 wasn't just a repair mission, it was a medical experiment, and the guinea pigs were the men floating inside. Let us take a tour of this new home. Skylab was unlike any spacecraft that had come before. The Apollo command module was a phone booth. 3 men strapped into couches, knees touching, sharing a volume of about 210 cubic feet. Skylab was a cathedral. The main workshop had a volume of over 10,000 cubic feet. It was a cylinder 22 feet wide. For the first time, astronauts didn't just float, they flew. They could push off a wall at one end of the workshop and glide for 30 feet, Superman style, before grabbing a handrail at the other end. They could do somersaults. They could run around the circumference of the storage lockers using centrifugal force to generate artificial gravity, looking like hamsters in a giant wheel. It was exhilarating. It was freedom. But it was also disorienting. In a small capsule, down is always where your feet are strapped. In Skylab, down was a suggestion. You could work on a panel on the ceiling, sleep on the wall, and eat on the floor. The crew quickly realized that they had to adapt their movements. If you pushed off too hard, you would smash into the opposite wall with bruising force. They had to learn the Skylab glide, a gentle, controlled drift. Life on board settled into a rhythm. They woke up at 6 a.m. Houston time. The bedroom, the sleep quarters, was a small compartment partitioned off for privacy. The sleeping bags were essentially vertical coons tied to the wall. Sleeping in space is strange. Your head doesn't rest on a pillow. Your arms float up in front of your face. You are suspended in nothingness. Pete Conrad slept soundly. He was a man who could sleep through a hurricane. After waking, they had to face the most dreaded aspect of spaceflight, the bathroom. On Apollo, the bathroom situation was primitive. Plastic bags and sticky tape. On Skylab, NASA had built a waste management system. It was a hole in the wall with a fan to create suction. But because this was a medical mission, everything had to be saved. Everything. The doctors wanted to analyze the astronauts' metabolism. So the crew had to dry and vacuum seal their solid waste and freeze their liquid waste. It was a tedious, unglamorous, and often messy job. They called it playing the numbers. I'm going to make a deposit, Weitz would say. It took 30 minutes just to use the facilities. It was the price of science. Then came breakfast. The wardroom was the heart of the station. It had a table, a real table with magnetic trays to hold the food cans. The food on Skylab was a massive upgrade from the squeeze tubes of the early days. They had a freezer. They had an oven. They ate prime rib, lobster bisque, vanilla ice cream. But eating in zero gears is tricky. If you open a spoon too fast, the soup keeps going. If you open a packet of peanuts, you create a cloud of shrapnel that you have to chase down and eat out of the air like a fish. The sense of taste changed too. Without gravity, fluids in the body shift upward, the legs get skinny bird legs, and the face gets puffy moon face. the sinuses congest. It feels like having a permanent head cold. So, the food tasted bland. They craved hot sauce. They craved spice. They put horseradish on everything just to feel something. After breakfast, the work began. The repair of the solar wing had saved the mission, but it hadn't fixed the gyroscope. Skylab was stabilized by 3 massive control moment gyroscopes, CMGs. These were heavy flywheels spinning at thousands of revolutions per minute. By tilting them, the station could turn without using thruster fuel. But the heat from the launch accident had damaged the bearings on one of the gyros. It was glitching. The computer would suddenly scream a warning. The station would drift. The astronauts had to become system managers. They watched the dials. They managed the momentum. But the primary job was solar astronomy. This was the jewel of the mission. The Apollo Telescope Mount, ATM. It was the most powerful solar observatory ever built, and it was manned. This is a crucial distinction. Today, our telescopes are robots. Hubble, James Webb, they are automated. But on Skylab, the astronaut looked through the eyepiece. He sat at a console that looked like the dashboard of a sci-fi battleship. Screens, dials, joysticks. He watched the sun in real time. He looked for transients, solar flares. Explosions on the surface of the star that released the energy of 1 billion hydrogen bombs. If he saw a flare starting, a brightening of the X-ray image, he had seconds to react. He had to hit the triggers. He had to slew the cameras. He had to capture the data before the event ended. It was big game hunting. "Got one," Kerwin would shout. "She's blowing." They captured thousands of images of the sun. They saw coronal mass ejections. They saw the solar wind for the first time. They proved that a human eye and a human brain were faster and more adaptable than any computer. One day, a massive flare erupted. The automatic sensors missed it, but the astronaut at the console saw it. He zoomed in. He recorded the entire life cycle of the storm. That data changed our understanding of solar physics. It helped us understand how the sun affects the Earth's weather and radio communications. It was worth the price of the ticket. But it wasn't all staring at the sun. They were also looking down. The Earth Resources Experiment Package EREP. They took photos of the Earth. They tracked crop health. They tracked ocean currents. They looked for mineral deposits. They were the first crew to see the effects of humanity on a global scale. They saw the smog over Los Angeles. They saw the deforestation in the Amazon. They saw the drying of Lake Chad. They realized that the planet was changing, and not for the better. Paul Weitz looked down at the swirling clouds and the blue oceans. "You know," he said, "you don't see any borders from here. It's just one big spaceship." It was the overview effect again, the realization that we are all crew. The days turned into weeks. The novelty of zero gravity began to wear off. The grind set in. They missed their families. They missed the feeling of wind. They missed the smell of rain. The station smelled of machine oil, ozone, and sterilized wipes. They exercised. They had to. To prevent bone loss, they rode a stationary bike. But riding a bike in zero gravity is ridiculous. You have to strap yourself down with bungees. You pedal, but you don't go anywhere. You sweat, but the sweat doesn't drip. It pools on your skin in a thick, trembling layer. You have to towel it off constantly or it flies into your eyes. They ran around the water tanks. They measured their own bodies. Every day they took blood samples. They measured their leg circumference. They spun in a rotating chair to test their inner ears. They were lab rats, and they knew it. But they were led by Pete Conrad. And Conrad knew how to keep morale up. He was a prankster. He was a ball of energy. He organized the Skylab 500, a race around the lockers. He encouraged them to look out the window, to take time to just be. One evening, while passing over the United States, they played music. They played the theme from 2001: A Space Odyssey over the radio loop. They did gymnastics for the television camera. They showed the world that living in space wasn't just survival. It could be fun. But there was a moment of fear. About halfway through the mission, Joe Kerwin, the doctor, noticed something. He was measuring Pete Conrad's cardiovascular response on the bike. Conrad's heart was working harder than it should. His stroke volume, the amount of blood pumped with each beat, was dropping. His heart was getting lazy. Without gravity to fight against, the heart muscle was shrinking. "We need to up the exercise," Kerwin said, "or we're going to pass out when we hit gravity." They increased the resistance on the bike. They worked harder. They were fighting the environment. Space wants to make you soft. It wants to turn you into a jellyfish. You have to fight to remain human. As day 25 approached, the end was in sight. They had accomplished 100% of the mission goals. They had repaired the ship. They had saved the science. They had broken the duration record, but the ship was tired. The gyroscopes were overheating again. The cooling system was leaking. Skylab was a wounded bird that had flown one last great flight. They began to pack up. They loaded the film canisters, thousands of precious images, into the Apollo command module. They loaded the blood and urine samples. They cleaned the station. They vacuumed the filters. They left food and supplies for the next crew. Skylab 3, led by Al Bean, would launch in July. They left a sign on the locker, "Sal, cheap." It was time to go, but leaving was bittersweet. They had cursed the station when they arrived. It was hot, broken, and dangerous. But now it was home. They knew every creak. They knew the best place to sleep. They knew how to glide perfectly from the wardroom to the telescope. They had bonded with the machine. On the final day, June 22nd, 1973, they suited up. They floated into the Apollo capsule. They closed the hatch to the station. The heavy wheels spun. The seal locked. They were separated. Skylab was alone again. A ghost ship drifting in the dark. Conrad sat in the commander's seat of the Apollo. "Undocking," he said. The latches released. The springs pushed them away. They drifted back. They looked at the station through the windows. It looked battered. The gold foil was peeling. The parasol was grey and faded from the sun. The missing solar wing made it look lopsided, but it was beautiful. It was a testament to what men can do with their hands. "She's a good ship," Conrad said. "She took care of us." They fired the thrusters. They performed a fly-around inspection. They took photos of their handiwork, and then they fired the big engine. The service propulsion system, SPS, roared to life. The kick of acceleration pushed them back into their seats. For 28 days, they had been weightless. Now, even the small thrust of the engine felt heavy. Their heads felt like bowling balls. Their arms felt like lead. They were heading down, back to the atmosphere, back to the gravity, back to the world of heavy things. The re-entry of Skylab 2 was a concern for the doctors. Would the men be able to withstand the G-forces? They had been floating for a month. Their bones were thinner. Their hearts were smaller. Now they were about to be crushed by 4Gs. They drank entry water, supersalinated water, to boost their blood volume. They squeezed their leg muscles. They hit the atmosphere. The fire started outside the window, the pink glow. The roar. Conrad watched the G-meter, 1G, 2Gs. It felt brutal. "Ugh," Whites grunted. "I feel like I weigh a ton." 3Gs. Their vision narrowed. They fought the grey out, but they held on. They were tough. The parachutes opened. The jolt shook them. The jolt shook them. They swung under the orange canopies. They hit the Pacific Ocean. Splash. The capsule bobbed. They were down. But the real test was just beginning. Could they walk? The recovery teams arrived. The hatch opened. The fresh sea air rushed in. The doctors were there. They wanted to carry the astronauts out on stretchers, but Pete Conrad was a proud man. "I'm walking," he said. He tried to stand up inside the capsule. His legs trembled, his inner ears spun, the world tilted. Gravity felt like a crushing punishment, but he forced his legs to lock. He grabbed the rim of the hatch. He pulled himself out. He stood on the deck of the recovery ship, the USS Ticonderoga. He wobbled. He looked like a drunk man trying to navigate a storm. But he stood. He waved to the sailors. "We're back," he shouted. It was a victory. They had proven that humans could live in space. They had proven that we are not just visitors. We can be residents. And they had proven that if you give a good mechanic a pry bar, he can fix anything, even in orbit. The legacy of Skylab 2 is immense. Without that mission, Skylab would have been a failure. A $2 billion fireball. Because of Conrad and his crew, Skylab went on to host 2 more missions. Skylab 3 stayed for 59 days. Skylab 4 stayed for 84 days. They gathered mountains of data. They proved that humans can work in space for months. This paved the way for the space shuttle. It paved the way for the ISS. Every time an astronaut on the ISS fixes a broken toilet or replaces a battery, they are walking in the footsteps of Pete Conrad. They are using the can-do spirit that saved the burning house in the sky. But what happened to Skylab itself? The station was abandoned in 1974. It was supposed to stay in orbit for 10 years. NASA hoped to send the space shuttle to boost it to a higher orbit in the early 1980s. They wanted to save it, to turn it into a museum or a depot. But physics had other plans. The sun became active. Solar flares heated the Earth's upper atmosphere. The atmosphere expanded. It reached up and grabbed Skylab. The drag increased. The station began to fall. Faster and faster. The shuttle wasn't ready. The delays in the shuttle program meant there was no way to reach it in time. Skylab was doomed. The house that Pete Conrad saved was coming down, and it wasn't going to be a gentle landing. It was 77 tons of metal falling uncontrolled out of the sky, and nobody knew exactly where it would hit. In the final part of our story, we will witness the fiery death of Skylab. We will see the panic around the world as the falling laboratory dominated the headlines. We will see the end of an era, and we will reflect on the golden age of fix-it engineering, the era when we didn't just throw things away, we fixed them, even if they were flying at 17,000 miles per hour. February 1974. The last crew, Skylab 4, has departed. They turned off the lights. They closed the hatch. They undocked their Apollo capsule and drifted away, leaving the massive station alone in the black. For the first time in 9 months, the workshop was silent. No fans hummed, no pumps whirred, no astronauts laughed or cursed at stuck bolts. Skylab was a ghost ship. It was a 77-ton tomb of aluminum and gold foil, tumbling slowly over the Earth. Inside, the lockers were full of food. There were spare clothes. There were books left half-read. There was a sign taped to the wall by the last commander, "Jerry Carr, leave the light on." But the lights were off. NASA had a plan. They always had a plan. Skylab was supposed to sleep. It was placed into a storage orbit, a high-altitude parking spot where it would drift for 8 or 10 years. The plan was to wait for the next great American machine, the space shuttle. The shuttle was being built in California. It was going to be a truck, a reusable cargo hauler. The idea was to launch the shuttle in 1979 or 1980, fly it up to Skylab, and attach a booster engine to the station. They would push Skylab higher. They would refurbish it. They would turn it into a permanent outpost. It was a beautiful dream. The house that Pete Conrad saved would be renovated for the next generation. But in space, timing is everything, and physics doesn't care about construction delays. The shuttle was late. Technical problems with the main engines and the thermal tiles pushed the launch date back. 1979 became 1980, 1980 became 1981. Meanwhile, the Sun woke up. The Sun goes through an 11-year cycle of activity. In the late 1970s, it entered a solar maximum. It began to spit out flares and high-energy radiation. This radiation hit the Earth's upper atmosphere. When you heat a gas, it expands. The envelope of the Earth's atmosphere puffed out like a balloon. The thin, tenuous air at Skylab's altitude got thicker. It wasn't much, just a few more molecules per cubic inch, but at 17,000 miles per hour, it was enough. Drag. Friction. The atmosphere reached up and grabbed the station. It slowed it down. As Skylab slowed, it dropped. As it dropped, the air got thicker, which made it slow down more. It was a death spiral. By 1978, the telemetry was clear. Skylab wasn't going to stay up until 1983. It was coming down in mid-1979, and the shuttle wouldn't be ready. NASA realized the truth. They couldn't save it. The house was going to burn. The year 1979 was a strange time in America. It was the era of disco, gas shortages, and a general sense of malaise. And suddenly, there was a new worry. The sky was falling. The news broke. A 77-ton American space station is going to crash, and NASA doesn't know where. It triggered a global media frenzy. It was part panic, part party. Newspapers printed maps with danger zones that covered half the planet. Entrepreneurs sold Skylab survival kits containing hard hats and targets painted on helmets. In Washington, D.C., there were Skylab parties scheduled for the crash night. In India, people slept outdoors, afraid their roofs would collapse. In the Philippines, the president went on television to calm the nation. It was the Chicken Little story come to life. But inside Mission Control, it wasn't a joke. It was a crisis. Skylab was huge. It wasn't a satellite that would burn up into dust. It was made of thick aluminum tanks, heavy titanium spheres, and massive steel flywheels. The engineers calculated that about 50,000 pounds of debris would survive re-entry. That includes the film vault, a lead-line safe weighing hundreds of pounds. If that hit a city, it would be like a bomb. If it hit a crowded stadium, the death toll could be catastrophic. NASA didn't have a joystick. They couldn't fly Skylab like a plane. The thrusters were mostly dry. The gyroscopes were failing, but they could trim it. They could send commands to the computer to change the station's orientation. If they turned it broadside to the wind, drag would increase and it would fall faster. If they turned it nose first, end on velocity vector, it would slice through the air and fall slower. They could use this drag modulation to steer the crash point. They could aim it. The target was the Oceanic Graveyard, a vast, empty stretch of the South Indian Ocean, far from shipping lanes and continents. They formed a special team in Houston, the Skylab re-entry team. They worked in shifts 24 hours a day, watching the tracking data. It was a high-stakes game of mathematical roulette. They had to predict the solar activity, which is unpredictable. They had to predict the atmospheric density, which changes hourly. If they were wrong by 1% in their drag calculation, the station would miss the ocean by 3,000 miles. It could hit London. It could hit Tokyo. It could hit New York. July 10th, 1979, the final hours. Skylab was skimming the top of the atmosphere. It was visible from the ground as a bright, fast-moving star. The drag was tearing at the solar panels. The station was groaning. The controllers in Houston made their move. They commanded the station to tumble. They wanted to increase drag at a precise moment so it would plunge into the ocean south of Cape Town, South Africa. Tumble command sent, the flight director said. The station responded. It began to spin. The drag spiked. The descent accelerated, but Skylab was tough. It was built by the men who built the Saturn V. It held together longer than the computer models predicted. It didn't break up at 70 miles. It didn't break up at 60 miles. It kept flying. It overshot the target. It flew over the Atlantic. It flew over the Indian Ocean. It passed the safe zone. It was heading toward land, toward Australia. July 11th, 1979, 12:30 a.m. local time, Western Australia. The small coastal town of Esperance was asleep. It is a quiet place, a community of farmers and fishermen on the edge of the Southern Ocean. The sky was clear and moonless. The Milky Way was bright. Suddenly, the dog started barking. Then came the light. It wasn't a flash. It was a sunrise in the middle of the night. A massive burning object appeared over the Indian Ocean, traveling from the southwest. It broke into pieces. First 3, then 10, then hundreds. Each piece was a fireball, trailing a long tail of orange, green, and blue plasma. The colors came from the burning metals: copper, magnesium, titanium. It looked like a majestic, terrifying formation of fighter jets in afterburner, flying silently across the sky. And then the sound arrived. Boom! A sonic boom that rattled windows, knocked birds out of trees, and shook the beer glasses off the tables in the local pub. The roar was continuous, like a freight train passing directly overhead. The residents of Esperance ran outside in their pajamas. They watched in awe as the debris of America's space program rained down on the outback. It didn't hit the town directly. It scattered across the Shire of Esperance, a vast area of scrubland and sheep farms. No one was hurt. One cow was reportedly frightened but unharmed. The largest piece, a massive oxygen tank, landed on a farm. The farmer, looking at the smoking crater the next morning, scratched his head. "Well," he said, "I guess the Yanks are here." The recovery became a treasure hunt. NASA teams flew to Australia. Media from all over the world descended on Esperance. The San Francisco Examiner had offered a $10,000 reward for the first piece of Skylab delivered to their office. A 17-year-old Australian boy named Stan Thornton found some charred pieces on the roof of his house. He grabbed them, jumped on a plane to California, and claimed the prize. The town of Esperance took it with good humor. The local council issued a littering $400. It was a joke, but they sent the ticket. NASA didn't pay it, but years later, a radio DJ in California raised the money from listeners and paid the fine on NASA's behalf. President Jimmy Carter issued a statement apologizing to Australia, but the Australians were mostly just excited. They threw a Miss Skylab beauty pageant. They put pieces of the debris in the local museum, where they sit to this day, twisted, melted shards of titanium that once housed astronauts. With the crash of Skylab, an era ended. The era of the can-do repair was over. The era of the Saturn V was over. NASA entered a lull. The Space Shuttle Columbia wouldn't launch until 1981. For 2 years, America had no way to get to space. We were grounded. Skylab was a bridge that burned before we could cross it again. But its legacy is indestructible. Look at the International Space Station, ISS, today. It has been permanently inhabited for over 20 years. It uses solar rays. It uses gyroscopes. It uses a water recycling system. All of those technologies were tested on Skylab. The medical data gathered by Pete Conrad and his crew, the bone loss charts, the cardiovascular studies, are the Bible of modern space medicine. We know how to keep people alive on the way to Mars because 3 guys spent a month in a converted fuel tank in 1973, and the spirit of the repair lives on. When the Hubble Space Telescope was launched with a flawed mirror, everyone said it was a disaster, a billion-dollar blunder. But the astronauts said, "No, we can fix it." They went up. They did 5 spacewalks. They installed a corrective lens. They saved the telescope. That mindset, the refusal to accept that a machine is dead as long as there are humans willing to work on it, that comes from Skylab. It comes from Pete Conrad hanging by his knees in the vacuum, pulling on a stuck beam with all his might. As we conclude this journey, let us reflect on the machine itself. Skylab was ugly. It was a repurposed tank. It was hot. It was smelly. It was noisy. But it was tough. It survived a launch explosion. It survived freezing cold and boiling heat. It survived abandonment. And in the end, it went out in a blaze of glory, putting on a light show for the world. It was a machine with a soul forged by the engineers who built it and the astronauts who saved it. It represents a time when we weren't afraid to get our hands dirty, a time when we fixed things instead of throwing them away, a time when we looked at a disaster and saw a challenge. Let the image of the burning station fade. The fire is out. The dust has settled in the Australian desert. The night is quiet again. Imagine you are back in the workshop during the good days. The lights are dim. The fans are humming. You are floating by the window. You see the Earth below, a peaceful blue curve. You see the solar wing, bent but working, shining in the sun. You are safe inside the house that ingenuity built. There is a comfort in knowing that things can be fixed. That no matter how bad the damage, if you have the right tools and the right attitude, you can make it work. You can turn on the lights. You can keep flying. Drift now. Let the gravity of Earth hold you, just as it held Skylab in its final embrace. The work is done. The tools are put away. The crew is home. The station is at rest.